Welcome to Sports CTO Talks. In this series, we would be connecting with technology leaders into the sports industry, where we will simplify sports technology. I am Ami, your guide on this journey through amazing mind of tech leaders. We will dive deep into discussions driving the industry, from AI to cloud, from cybersecurity to sustainability. If it is sports tech, we are talking about it. Today we have with us Scott Dinsdale. He is a global recognized leader in digital technology, media, and sports with more than 3 decades of experience driving business transformation across financial sector, entertainment, and sports. He has held senior executive roles at multiple organizations like Sony, Accenture, and the Motion Picture Associations, and many more. He's shaping the industry through eras defining Napster, iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. As a managing director of FutureNext, Scott advises boards and C-suites on navigating AI, innovational, and organizational change. He is also the content director of Sports Next. And there is a long list which I would love to share. Scott, over to you. Thank you for joining.
Oh, glad to be here. Glad to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
Perfect. So, like my first question and a very basic one for understanding, like you are into the industry from so many decades. So, where do you see the intersection of technology and entertainment? Like how it is parallel driving the digital transformation and the ongoing media evolution in sports, and how it might affect the India and Australia collaboration, and where do you what is it? How does it work?
How does it work? That's a big question. Um, I think I mean everything is a moment in time, right? And so you have to take everything in its context, right? And I think for a long time, technology was, let's just say, an extension to things, extension to sport, extension to this, right? What's happened over the last, it's probably 20, 25 years, is that technology is now embedded and connected to everything. And so I would argue that, and let me say this in business first, and then I think it's easy now, although it's been a little later to translate in sport. You can't disconnect the notion of digital and technology with the notion of business anymore, right? You really can't. I mean, I suppose you could run maybe a scuba diving shop in a desert island. That would be great, right? But
Hmm.
just about anywhere else, all right, you just can't take the notion of digital and technology and move them apart. Now, whether you're focused on supply chain technology or consumer technology or whatever it may be that's going to help you be competitive, there may be one area you're emphasizing more than another. But ultimately, you really don't think about any aspect of what you do without a digital or technology component. And sport has now moved there. When you look at the entertainment industries, and I think this analogy is fair. When you think about the most digital products to the least digital products, that's been kind of the order within which that the industry is transformed, right? So, gaming was never analog, right? So the
Hmm.
very early days of gaming in the 80s and 90s, gaming was digital. It was always digital. Although, if you remember, it early imitated physical games, ping pong games, athletic games. So there was even a component of that imitation there, even though it was always digital. Music of all the other forms of entertainment, music was the most digital. The time that digital hit music was in the 80s and 90s. We were already digital as an industry. That's what CDs were. And so it was the one that was transformed the first, the fastest, and probably the most aggressively. It was the one that sort of hit the digital industry or the technology industry, and it was the one that ran into the truck first, as opposed to seeing the headlights coming. The other industries saw the headlights coming. So music transformed first. Games already was, and then you went to sort of movies that were already big into technology anyway, with special effects and all those sorts of things. And then eventually that was sort of in the 2000s, and then kind of the 2010s, television kind of production moved into that realm. And during that time as well, sport became more and more digital, now to the point where, and this is sort of a good test, right? If you think about the very endpoints of sport, right? The athlete on the field, all right,
Hmm. Hmm.
competing and the steps they're taking to do whatever they need to do, right? Or swim or whatever it is, or swing a bat. And on the other end is the consumer that's watching them, just the casual consumer, not even the super fan. We now can connect those two digitally, right? You can
Hmm.
sit at home on your screen and watch the bat speed of somebody swinging a bat in the IPL
Correct.
and the exit speed of their of their six, right? And so the entire ecosystem is digitized. The challenge is that all that stuff is still pretty new, like in human time. So
Hmm.
let's be generous and say 20 years. Probably better to say more like 10, but let's say 20 years. Well, most of the managers in these businesses, right, didn't grow up with technology around them. They grew up with a very different way of doing things. And so the challenge you have really is twofold, and I wouldn't say either is easier than the other. One is what is the technology is going to make a difference? So now people are focused on AI and other things. So it's not just a you don't run after technology for technology's sake. What's technology, that you should use that's going to make a difference? And that's really hard in sport because most sport organizations are actually quite small compared to big companies in the
Correct.
insurance or banking or whatever other business, right? So it's important to make those choices well. And then the other thing is you've then got to transform your organization in some way, sometimes in a big way, sometimes in a little way. And the people who need to lead that charge, the leaders of the business, are probably the most distant from understanding what that technology can do. And so that's a big challenge. So that's a lot of stuff, but that's kind of the big picture, the way I look at it.
Okay. So like how can India and Australia, like, where do you see like how can they collaborate to set new benchmarks it can be in sports broadcasting, in at OTT platforms or fan-centric innovations, like what do you see? What is shaping up now?
So, so I think, it's when you have these conversations, it's a little bit like matchmaking, right? You got two friends and you're trying to figure out, well, should I introduce those two friends, right? I still want them to be my friends, and if I introduce them and they doesn't work out, could be bad, right? So this is a little bit like the same conversation. And you mentioned that I curate Sport Next, the sports conference in Melbourne, which is a lot of fun to do. And one of the fun parts of it when you curate a conference like that is you can take a few chances in the program. And you can say, here's a really interesting subject that I just really like to explore. I really don't know where this is going to go, right? But let me put it together. And the long story short is I put together a panel which had someone in India very focused on particularly high performance and really moving that forward in India, and someone from Australia's AIS, which, as you know, is sort of a long-standing sort of high performance institute.
Correct.
Now, on the surface, all right, you'd go, well, that's okay, that's a little weird. India's now really growing in sport, but doesn't necessarily, other than cricket and maybe, in the villages, kabaddi and a few other things, doesn't have a long tradition in sport. And Australia's got this magnificent tradition in sport. I
Yes.
get what Australia might be able to teach India. What can India teach Australia? All
Hmm.
right. It was about 10 minutes, not on stage. This is off stage. It was about 10 minutes into the first conversation. All right. And I'll just give you, and I won't, I just sat back and listened, and I won't try and give you the depth of detail because it was a fun conversation to listen to. The short version was Australia's apparently had a problem with translating its kind of big sports programs into the Aboriginal communities. And they never quite been able to figure out how to do that well. And whoever it was from India was talking, they were talking about the fact that, well, the big challenge in India is because there's no such thing as India, right? You've got these villages, to which I pause and say, remind her of villages like maybe 200,000 people, right? Um, and you have to build programs that really can cross these cultural barriers. All of a sudden, this conversation broke out as to whether those kinds of techniques in India could be used directly to do a better job at their Aboriginal program, because that's the way the Aboriginals community is organized. Yes, it's one large community, right? And they look at each other in that community, but it's actually made up of all these sort of tribes and groups of people and organizations that have quite different views and cultures and backgrounds and languages and stuff. And so that's a long way of saying, all right, that if I think about sport and tech, all right, and that's really my focus here, right, is sport tech.
Correct.
And I think about those two words. I think Australia, India, right? Australia is, the land of sport, right?
Yes.
It's crazy how much sport there is here. Okay. India is aggressively growing the profile
Growing.
of sport in many ways, all right,
Absolutely.
in India, but it's on the journey, right? But India is very well established, right, as one of the, I don't know, four or five
Mhm.
top leading technology centers in the world.
Hmm.
All right. Australia is doing okay, all right, but it certainly is not in that league. All
Hmm.
right. Well, I'm campaigning to make sport tech a much more important part of the sporting industry in Australia and the digital ecosystem of Australia. And
Absolutely.
I can't think of a better partner, all right, from a country standpoint than India. there's already a lot of work going on building the relationship. So it's like we've got some good air cover, right, coming from, the political goodwill between the two countries. There certainly are other forces at play that would suggest that maybe we're better partners than maybe other traditional partners. So I just put that out there, and I'd love to hear, more from, Indian entrepreneurs, Indian people focused on the sport tech sector in India, and just start talking about, what can be done. And I know there's already some conversations going on. There's associations here like the
Yes.
ASTN that I know reaches out to India. So I'm not looking to short circuit any of those conversations. I'm just looking to focus and enrich it because I think certainly Australia would benefit from a much stronger sport tech sector. And as a partner, as I said, I can't think of a much better partner than India.
Correct. So, like, these days, everyone is talking about AI integration into multiple
Yep.
fields. So, how do you see AI generated content influencing sports storytelling and fan experience?
Well, I mean, the easiest way, the easiest thing to say is it's a bit hard to predict, right? I think, when we look at what's going on in AI, um, it's one of those things where it's really hard to tell whether, how crude what we're doing now in AI really is. And let me give you an example, right? So everybody talks about this notion of large language models, right, that sit underneath all of these big AI engines, right? And understand what that means. Okay, that basically means that every input has to be translated into a language and then parsed and then answered in that language and then reoriented to whatever the output is. So, for example, if I have an AI engine that's generating music, it doesn't understand music until it translates that music into language. As a former musician, I'm like, well, why would you do that?
Hmm.
Right? I mean, music is its own language. Okay, I don't translate, notes and scales into English or German or French. It's like, why would I do that? Right? And so there's a big part of me that is very curious about um, the ultimately where it goes. And we talk about it. So the reason I say this is media, right? Because I think in the media space, everyone thinks about AI generated images, and certainly that's both interesting and an issue, right? I think that's probably the wrong place to put most of your energy today,
Okay.
and today, right?
Hmm.
And the reason I say that is there's an enormous amount of savings that I think can be done in the media space, particularly. I mean, you talk about gaming, for example. One of our recent conferences, the head of one of the major gaming companies suggested they could cut the cost of production in half, all right, by using AI to basically go and take players, images and put them on the game engines, all those sorts of things that were very manual things to be done before. And so I think that right now AI is going to be, I think, very good at helping the processes. I don't think the
Okay.
output from AI yet is even marginally close to where it's going to go. I mean, the studios will experiment. The very, very leading edge stuff, all right, we'll play with that.
Hmm.
But I think if you're relying on creativity being something you can outsource anytime soon, that's unlikely. What I do think you can do is I think you can focus on utilizing AI to really drive better processes, faster processes, cheaper processes. That's where I'd focus my energy right now,
Okay.
including the distribution side, but that's another conversation.
Okay. So, like, when you're talking about this, like, how can or how is AI driven commentators or virtual host changing the sports media?
So I think what they'll do is they'll supercharge a trend that's already starting slowly, right? Which is this notion that one commentary works for all. Um, I mean, that's, or in the case of India, 17 commentaries work for all, right? But the point being that the idea of me talking to so many people, I think that starts breaking down, right? And I think it breaks down on some very simple lines, all right? Some people like things to be funny. Some things people like to be light. People like things to talk to them as if I'm a seasoned professional. Don't give me any of that. Other people are like, no, I'm just learning, right? And so there's so many different things that and ways that people should be talked to in a sporting engagement. And so I think, the idea of creating what, 17 times 20, right, broadcast is probably not feasible. But as AI commentary gets better, I think it starts to enable a much better connection with fans and to sort of nurture that because it's right now and not just in social media but in long form, because I think what's starting to happen for those not in the stadium, we always have to remember that for most sports the people who actually attend is hopefully a very small portion, right, of those
Hmm.
people who actually watch.
Correct.
um, and so because of that, the idea that now people are really turning to highlights
Hmm.
and turning to very condensed versions. Look, as a marketing tool, okay, but as a tool for people really getting engaged and consuming, you really want them to be engaged for that full session as much as possible. And so there's a product you may not know, but there's a product out of the US you can now get globally called Red Zone as part of the NFL's Game Pass.
Hmm.
And basically, it's like an ADHD television channel,
Okay.
right? What it does is it just so at any time in the NFL, there's on a Sunday, there's maybe 4 to 6 games going at the same time. And so what it does is it jumps around to the games as something interesting happens in each game, right? And so you're never not occupied with something, right? And so that kind of thing is what will more and more engage people as opposed to short per se, short form content. But you need to have the ability to do that at scale, and you're not going to be able to do that at scale without AI.
Okay. So when you're talking about these short videos, like how does it rise, the short form of the videos, and is it impacting the traditional sports broadcasting strategies, or like, how does that work?
So let me just make a counter argument for half a second, right? And then I'll answer your question properly, right? So the counter argument is there's no reason we need to go this fast, right? We weren't designed to go this fast, right? The world's going fast, but humans just don't go that fast, at least traditionally,
Correct.
right? And
Correct.
so I actually think there's a market for the ability to slow things down. All right. And so I think, I think people should not abandon the notion of long form content.
Hmm.
They should rise to the challenge that short form content is now more entertaining than it's been in the past, right? It used to be short term form content was a commercial, right? And that's not that entertaining, right?
It
So
is not.
new competition in town, right? Short form content, fair enough. But I would start just simply by saying, I think people need to continue to invest in long form, which at the end of the day is nothing more and nothing less than continue to invest in quality. Not just the quality of the broadcast and the recording and all that sort of stuff, not just the multi-channel nature of that, right? But the quality of the stuff on the field, right? So that aside, look, I think short form content is here to stay. I think it's gotten, I think the thing that's gotten off the rails with short form content is targeting.
Hmm.
Um, when you think about, I mean, I would just use YouTube to pick on somebody, right? No offense to YouTube in particular, because this is certainly not
Yes,
just
yes.
them, but just if you look at, unless you spend an enormous amount of time trying to polish up the algorithm, all
Hmm.
right? When you look at what YouTube throws in front of you, right? Those,
Correct.
whatever it is, those 10 to 20 tiles, maybe it's a 50% hit rate,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I've been using YouTube since we licensed the music back in 2005, right? You'd think they'd know me a little better by now, right? Now, I like a little variety thrown in too, right? But
Hmm.
this notion of being able to really do a much better job at appealing to me, which in my book, by the way, includes, making sure I hear other people's opinions, all that sort of stuff. But those are things
Hmm.
you should be able to tell and program. That again, that can't be done at scale without it being done in background by something like AI, right?
Hmm.
And so I think distribution, the challenge that short form has is not, how do you produce better or worse content, right? There's lots of good content out there. Will it get better? Sure, of course it will. There'll be better tools. That's not the real challenge. If I were to say, what's the real challenge in short form? I'd say, how do you yourself and help the platforms just do a much better job at connecting you with the right content? I think that's the
Absolutely.
challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, like, what role do virtual influencers or AI-driven athlete personas play, like, in branding of the organization or branding of self? How is that?
Yeah, I think so. There's just, I think one thing in particular deserves attention. There's lots to talk about and lots to speculate about, right? The whole athlete persona thing. I think that's a much bigger conversation than people have let on, at least that I've heard. I'm not inside to a lot of those conversations, so we'll see. But certainly what I've heard is, this sounds interesting. It sounds like fun, blah, blah. Well, I would say two things, right? First of all, um, if someone is synthetic, make sure it's understood that they're synthetic. There's a controversy right now, if I don't know if you noticed in Hollywood about this synthetic actress
Yes.
that's been put up. And the biggest part of the controversy is they tried to introduce it without saying she was, right? Um, that sort of fuels a lot of people's view, right? So
Hmm.
that's kind of rule number one, right? Then I think rule number two, and then the offshoot of that is there are people who are now using AI, all right, to respond as athletes, right? To try and give them scale and all that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
That's a that's very interesting and very dangerous, right?
Hmm.
And the reason it's very dangerous, right, is that for the most part, AI tools are designed to respond, right? Not to tell, but to respond, right? And so it is very easy to imagine, right? A, a voice of an athlete, let's just call it that, all right, saying things to a fan that the athlete would never say, right? That may
Yes.
be fundamentally antithetical, right, to what they believe. It just
Hmm.
didn't happen to be on those five value boxes they ticked off to train the AI engine,
Hmm.
right? And now all of a sudden you got a fan base, all right, that thinks this guy's a jerk, right? When in fact, maybe he's a perfectly fine person or she's a perfectly fine gal, right? It's just some AI bot said something ridiculous to somebody and boom, it's across the internet. So I think, I get the idea. It's like the auto pen thing, right? So how do I get to sign and talk to people without it being me? I understand the desire. I understand what it's trying to do. I even understand people who say this is for the fans,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
But I don't know many good PR agents who would say, look, I don't care what you say. Just go ask the guy down the street what the right answer to the question is, and then just tell that to the press. Right? Right? And that's nearly what AI is doing these days with sort of a 50 to 60% hit rate.
Okay. So, like, what are the ethical considerations in this AI-driven athlete performance when we talk about it can be in analytics being used for media narratives, as you're talking about?
I mean, look, I don't know. I don't know that I have a hard line to cross, but um, there's really sort of two core considerations that should be given outside of, commercial value, insight, all that sort of stuff, right? One is just pure privacy. Right. And the re and just sort of just think about it for a second, right? So if I get things like heart rate and beat rate and all that sort of stuff,
Hmm.
is it possible at some point somebody creates an AI engine on the other end that can analyze that and say, hey, this guy's got an aortic infarction, he's going to die in a year, right? Right? Should that really be out there? Okay, right, right.
Exactly.
So there's and again, I'm not saying that things. I mean, things like how fast does somebody run, blah blah blah. That's kind of interesting, all that sort of thing, right? So there's certainly a lot of things that I think can easily be shared. Who owns that and how remuneration is handled for that is a whole other conversation. But leaving that to the side, um, yeah, that stuff's all fair ground. But there's probably some sets of information that probably doctors are better or statisticians are better at suggesting than I am
Hmm. Hmm.
as to, yeah, but don't let these variables go out because if you do, then potentially the public's going to know about something that they should know about before they know, or some such thing, right? So there's a line there. Then I think the line on the other end is, while it's not a thing in India, certainly in the rest of the world and growing, gambling is a huge part of
Yes.
sporting these days. I didn't ever think I'd see the day when it would be legalized in the U.S., but now it's not in every state in the U.S., but it certainly seems like it's going there. Moving to Australia, it's really shocking, right, to see how cultural it is.
Hmm.
And and so gambling's becoming a big thing. Well, look, the desire to gain unfair advantage in gambling has a very clear incentive, right? It's not like some indirect, good of the game kind of thing. It's very financial. And when you get money involved in something, money has a way of weaving its way through and doing
Absolutely.
things that maybe it shouldn't. So I think those are to me, yeah, I think it's great that a lot of these stats about athletes, because people are stats nuts and you can do interesting things and create digital twins and all sorts of fun stuff, all sorts of
Hmm.
really engaging things you can do with that. I think that's great, right? But I think you just need to keep in mind there are things that you wouldn't want somebody to know if you didn't know it. And there are things that some people really want to know, right, for their own financial gain that they could care less about the game and who you are. And so, those are, to me, those are kind of the boundary lines.
Okay. So what role does metaverse play in all this in sports and
What role does what,
entertainment?
sorry?
What role does metaverse play in sports and entertainment?
You know, I mean, it's hard not to imagine that
Hmm.
at some point, right, it won't be a very significant part of what we do, right? I mean, if you just you just think about the difference between a regular theater and an IMAX theater, right? If people still go to theaters, right?
People
It's like
do.
it's just a dramatically different experience, right? It's like, wow, okay, that's cool, right? Well, immersing inside a digital world, and whether that's to, fix a truck, right? Or whether it's to play a game, right? Or whether it's to watch a game. You can imagine that. But to me, it feels generational,
Okay.
you know? It's I mean, yeah, I know people are kind of afraid to fly, but 50 years ago, people were terrified to fly.
Hmm.
All right. And that's shifted. Okay. All right. Yeah, they'd fly, but all right. And now it's like, right, for the most part. Right. And so I think there's some things that kind of take these sort of shifts. Um, and then I think the other thing is just it's going to take a while for the technology to be completely unobtrusive because that's the challenge, right? How do you make a helmet that's not a helmet? And there are people working on it. The new Meta glasses and a few others I think are pretty good. And so we'll get there. I think I would expect that augmented reality will become a much bigger thing sooner, all right,
Hmm.
than
Hmm.
the sort of metaverse virtual reality environment. And the reason I sort of equate the virtual reality and metaverse, because they aren't the same thing. I get that, right? That
Hmm.
they aren't precisely the same thing,
Hmm.
right? But figuratively they are, right? In other words, the metaverse is a place you go to dwell, right? That's not a physical place. And so you need to be taken there. And VR is what takes you there.
Hmm.
And so that's why I kind of equate the two. But it will become a thing. I mean, Roblox is arguably part of the metaverse and it's reasonably popular at this point. But I don't think the metaverse is the metaverse until it's immersive.
Okay. So, like when we talk about AI, metaverse, and so many things, at the end, revenue is the key. So, what are the
Yep.
new revenue models emerging into the sports media other than subscriptions and ads?
Yeah, look, I think it's obviously very situational, right? It depends on what it is that's ringing the cash register today and what you'd like to, sort of do tomorrow. I think probably the one answer that I think probably covers that everybody can relate to, regardless of where you're sort of currently driving revenue, is on the experiences side, right? I think that, there's I think both the sort of the generation of kind of 30s and under, and part of this is because they've been robbed of the notion of owning a lot of stuff, or at least have to sort of put it to the side. So I'm not sure all of this is just transitional other than necessity, which is they just love experiences, right? They become kind of the ex drivers of the experience economy. And then I think on the other end, you got people who are sitting on lots of assets who have nothing better to do. And yeah, they don't mind going to the game, but gee, they'd rather be in the box or wherever it is, right? So I think there's an experience economy that's grown over the last while and an experience demand that I think some clubs are doing a decent job at trying to fulfill, but I think there's a long way to go there. So that's if there's one area, and the reason you focus on it is high margin, right? You like things to, move the revenue knob. This isn't necessarily going to move, depending on who you are, not necessarily move the revenue knob as big as a new big media deal or whatever it may be, but the margin's enormous on it. And so you're going to be able to, if you build it, build and execute it well. And in some cases, you may need to do partnerships, but that's the one area I think people should make sure they're focused on. And then everything else is situational, depending on whether, well, depending, right, on where the other your revenue channels are and what's healthy and what's not.
So when you're talking about, the younger athletes, so these days they are leveraging the digital first branding strategies or branding approach to turn professionals. So, like, how do you see it and how is it useful? Because you have worked into the industry from such a long time. So, how is it shifting? How is it changing?
Well, I mean, it goes without saying that you can use, those kinds of channels to build a following, right? So everybody knows that everybody's focused on that. I think that again, it sort of depends on kind of where you are in your career and what you're doing. Are you at the end of your career and trying to figure out where you're going to go? Are you at the start of your career and trying to sort of build your profile? Are you in the middle of your career and time to monetize? And that's kind of the hint there, right? Right, which is, in terms of how you use these channels, um, you know, um, there's a life skill there, right? To be able to understand a lot of stuff gets really outsourced to people, particularly if you're a professional athlete. And I think athletes should stay reasonably close to that, not right on it, but just like, you would if you had a regular PR agency. So I think there's some life skills you can learn, but I think it just translates to, use the tools focused on where you are in your career. And as I said, at the start of your career, it's mostly about building profile. You
Correct.
shouldn't be obsessed with, trying to make money at it yet. You hopefully don't need a lot of it because you're still relatively young. And secondarily, if you had to choose between making $1 and making 10,000 new followers, you'd probably choose the 10,000 followers. And so, putting paywalls up is not something you do. So, those would be the kind of things you do at the start of your career. I think when you get sort of in the middle of your career, you're being recognized, you built a following, that sort of thing, then to a large degree, um, it's about how do you leverage that? And by leverage it, I mean, people just say monetize. But for example, if you've got a charity or whatever you're after, well, that to me, that's monetization, right? It's your version of it, right? But at the end of the
Hmm.
day, how are you going to leverage your presence that you've built up and the presence you have off the field? And you know, it's your presence in digital will rarely exceed your presence on the field. And you always need to remember that, right, as an athlete, right?
Correct.
That, it's your presence on the field that fuels your digital presence, not the other way around. I remember I've been asked, I don't know how many times, what's the most important thing? And especially going back to the early days of digital, what's the most important thing this league or team or whatever can do, all right, to make sure it gets digital right and it gets good results? My answer is always win, baby, win. Right. You can screw digital up and so forth, but if you're a winning team, people will come to you,
People will
right? And
come.
people will make that happen. And that just simply says focus on what you do, focus on the field or in the pool or whatever you are, right, as an athlete and build a presence, then leverage that presence, and then as you want to move on to something else, right, how are you going to use that presence to help you do whatever it is you want to do next in life? And again, that's not the lead, right? The lead story is what do you want to do with the rest of your life, right? But the things you've done and the presence you've built should be helpful, right, in
Hmm.
taking you to
Hmm.
wherever that needs to go.
Correct. So, what are the risks you see in launching? Like, there are athletes who launch their own digital platforms. So, are there any risk associated with that? Or, as a team?
I just think no, I don't think there's not a risk per se. I think it's always about trade-offs, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, you don't want to divide your audience if you don't have to, right? You'd like to
Correct.
sort of aggregate your audience, right? So to give you a silly example, but I think it's a clear one, right? Yes, when I was with record companies, we'd have like the Sony Music site or we'd have the Arista site, right? The labels would have their sites, but we frankly didn't spend a lot of energy on those, right? The energy was spent on artist sites, right? Why would we want somebody who is interested in Annie Lennox, right, to come to a BMG site? I mean, so what? Okay, we want to surround Annie Lennox fans with Annie Lennox, right? Um, and so I think, it doesn't mean we didn't help her out and help her do her thing, but she was the brand, right? Not
Hmm.
us.
Hmm.
And so I think, when you position yourself, it's all situational, right? If you're a good player joining a great team, well, guess what? The brand's the team, right? And you want to leverage that brand, right, to help you and vice versa, right? But it's clear who's leading, right? On the other hand, if you're LeBron James, that's not quite so simple a conversation, right? Clearly he's got a presence and a following, right? And
Absolutely.
it's bigger than any of the teams, right, that he's on, right? And so in that case, you're nurturing both of those things. You don't want to take away from the team. It's not like you're going to say, well, I'm not going to appear on the team's website, right? So you're still part of that, right? But you do have your own presence to build. So again, I think it's really situational and it's a series of trade-offs. And it's just really sort of, honest concentration, honest conversation with yourself. I think as websites are concerned, I mean, specifically speaking to your question, I think it's good for an athlete to have their own Instagram presence, right? To
Hmm.
show who they are and build it up. Do I
Correct.
think an athlete has to have a website or a LinkedIn page? I don't think so, right?
Okay.
Maybe some athletes do. I mean, some athletes I know are trying to build a business career. Great, right? Try and leverage that into a LinkedIn page and what you do and connect those. And, because I think people appreciate people, particularly successful athletes, are likely to be successful in the rest of the world because they train hard, they work hard, they're goal focused, all those sorts of things. So you can leverage those two. But it's just a matter of saying, it's horses for courses, right? What are the
Hmm.
channels that should be there for me or for my team, and let's maximize those channels. But there's no one answer, I don't think.
Okay. So, like, when you were talking about this, the digital transformation, and like you have worked with Sony and multiple other companies. So, when you look at the India, Australia, again, like, from the starting, I'll take you back here. Like, when you look at the India, Australia ecosystem, what leadership qualities do you feel, or do you believe that are the most critical to navigate the rapid technological shifts what are happening right now? And it can be from grassroots level to elite to fan engagement.
Yeah, look, I think it's the standard sort of dichotomy it's always been, right? Um, one of the what's the right word? I think one of the pitfalls of environments like today in AI, right, is that everybody feels that they can come up with a great idea, right?
Yes.
Um, and that's not to say, by the way, people can't have a great idea as to how they can use AI. That's a different conversation. I think everybody can do that, right? But to come up with a company, something unique, something interesting, something that scales, something that builds, I think takes, especially in times of transition, takes two skills that are hard to find. And I think it's why you often find um, two different partners, right, in most really excellent startups. On the one hand, you need to be incredibly open and curious,
Hmm.
right? Because things are changing so fast. You need to be watching what's going
Yes.
around you, right? And on the other hand, you need to be very deeply competent and laser focused, right, on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to execute. So what you're doing is actually delivering value, right,
Hmm.
to that, right, as opposed to delivering some theoretical value, right?
Hmm.
Um, and those are two quite different things. I mean, you think about, I mean, just to use some very visible examples that most people know, um, if you think about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, right, who
Hmm.
basically founded Apple, that's who they were, right? Woz was an incredibly skilled engineer,
Correct.
right? Very focused, quite quiet, and quite inward, right? And Steve Jobs was the visionary, right? The big thinker, right?
Yes.
The open guy. Although, by the way, had some very, I mean, one of the things that really drove the Mac was his very specific calligraphy skills and stuff. But nonetheless, um, the two quite different perspectives. And I think that's
Hmm.
what it takes to succeed, is have a very open view as to what's going on and always looking around you, but at the same time, be laser focused on what it is that you're trying to accomplish and trying to deliver value for.
Okay. So, like, when you are talking about these two people, like, I would like, to ask you that as we see India and Australia, India offers massive scale. There is huge fan intensity while you see, and while on the opposite, Australia is often viewed as leader in high performance. Like, there is no doubt in
Mhm.
that, in innovations, in systems, in multiple things. So, from your perspective, how can leaders from both the countries cross pollinate ideas which can help in growth, whether it's performance, analytics, digital storytelling, anything?
Look, I think that you've answered the question nearly in your question, right? All mixed in, right? So I think um, if you to me, the market is the world, right? The market is neither India nor Australia. Okay, that's nice. Okay, a lot of people doing sport in India, a lot of people doing sport in Australia. Australia, India, massive, population. India or Australia, small population. That's nice. Okay, and I think that gives us a great playground between the two of us, right? In terms of the kinds of things you can play with and experiment with, from the kind of complexities of grassroots in India, right, through to the, world leading science of the AIS, right? We got the whole spectrum, right, between the two countries. And if our market's the world, and we're going to take over the world, right, in sport tech, right, to use Pinky in the Brain analogy, if that's what we're trying to do, then I think you always look for a complementary partner,
Correct.
right? And I think and I think we complement each other. All the things you said, right? Everything. I mean, I couldn't have said it better, right? You just kind of walk through all the things where we complement each other. I think that's very true, right? How we work together, right? I think is a whole other conversation, right? Because so far, I think we've worked together in a fairly traditional, um, if I look from the Indian lens, a fairly traditional model,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Australia has been a place to sell services, right? Australia has been a place to nurture talent, all right? And I don't think that differentiates us from any other country. Now, I think because we're relatively close physically and other things,
Hmm.
right? I think there's already a strong relationship, but I don't think our relationship is any different, right, than a normal Indian relationship. We need to change that, right? In this context. I don't care about the rest, but in sport tech, we need to change that. And I think we change that by starting to think very entrepreneurially. I actually mentor an Indian company that's in
Hmm.
the cricket bat business in India. And I think we nurture our sectors just by bringing our natural strengths, right? And that doesn't mean it's exclusive, right? You're going to get you're going to get some incredibly strong perspectives from India that one would have thought were Australian perspectives, not an Australian perspective, right? But very strong in sports science and other things. Because you've got brilliant people in that space, right? The fact that Australia over-indexes, well, so what, right? When we look at the technology side, you know, India can do anything in technology, right? Scaled, unscaled, you name it, right? I don't think a lot of people outside of India understand, or outside maybe in the US, understand how vibrant, right, the tech startup sector, right, is in India. And so I think there's a lot to offer there. I just think it takes sitting down and talking about how we make that happen. And it's between entrepreneurs, it's between governments. We're starting to construct that conversation on our end, and I'd love to talk to people on your end to continue that conversation.
Absolutely. So one last question, Scott. I have a few more,
Hmm.
but we'll stick to time. And one last question is,
Okay.
if like with decades of experience, if you had to advise the emerging sports tech leaders into the industry, what would it be? And how can it help grow, evolve in the coming or the next 10 years?
Yeah. I think my advice, and I'm not sure this is what they're looking for, but my advice would be make sure you're really passionate about it. Right. Sport is something that's really easy to get excited about. That's one of the great things. I mean, one of the fun things of my career, I spent most of my career in media, right? And it's easy to get excited about media because it's people.
Hmm.
You're not building widgets, okay, right? It's people's careers, it's making people cry, it's all those things, right? It's stuff you love to talk about when you're sitting down having dinner, right? And so you really love to be in the industry, and it's fun, and it's great fun to be in it, right? Here's the challenge, though, right? The challenge is it's small times two. Right. And what I mean by small times too is, first of all, the industry itself is quite small. People are, sometimes a little shocked, right? I
Hmm.
think the number last year was like sort of $70 billion for global media rights for everything,
Okay.
right? That's what a third of Microsoft's annual revenue, maybe less,
Hmm.
right? The entire industry, right?
Hmm.
So it's small. I used to do a thing at my daughter's school, and I talk about the entertainment industry when they were at school in Ottawa, in Canada. And I go in, and I was working at BMG at the time, or Sony at the time. And I tell these kids, I said, you need to be passionate and really care because I work with roughly about 3,500 other people and full time, and we make 25% of the world's music on any given week. That's it. All right. Now, that doesn't mean there's lots of other people involved. There are lots of other people involved, right?
Correct.
But those are all gig workers, right? In terms of the actual inside the company, it's relatively small. And so people understand sport is small. What that means is it's hyper competitive, right? Um,
Yes.
the se in two regards, right? So it's hyper competitive because it's relatively small and everybody wants to sell to it. It's hyper competitive as an individual because everybody wants to be there and work there, right? Now, neither of those, right, should discourage anybody from either going to sport or sport tech, right? They just need to go in with their eyes open, right? And understand that you need to be super passionate about it, right? Because you will encounter lots of competition. You'll have a gas along the way. It's a lot of fun, right? But there's a lot of competition, and so be passionate about it. So when things do get into the lows, because they occasionally do, you've got the fortitude to pull yourself out and move forward.
Perfect. Scott, we'll move on to the next segment into the podcast. That's the rapid fire round. I'll ask you a
Fire away.
few. Perfect. First question is, who is your favorite athlete of all time?
That's such a hard question to answer. Oh, like choosing, it's not quite this bad, but it's like choosing which is my favorite daughter. It's like, no, I can't answer that question. There's no such answer to that question. Boy, it's hard to point
Still,
to. But look,
still,
as a Canadian, current player or ever.
ever, forever.
Oh, it's hard to get past Gretzky
Okay,
as a hockey player. Yeah.
perfect. One word to describe the future of media.
Oh, I've got two. Which one am I going to give you?
Okay, go ahead.
Um, I'll give you the one my favorite, and but I have to explain. Malleable, constant, which just simply means constantly changing. All right, so malleable.
Perfect. AI in entertainment, overhyped or the real deal?
Um, it's certainly not overhyped. Um, I would say the way I would answer the question is neither of those. I would say give it time.
Okay.
Right. So it's overhyped in what it can do today.
Hmm.
It's underhyped in what eventually it'll do over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay. If you had to pick data analytics or storytelling, which drives fan engagement more?
Sorry, what kind of retelling?
Data analytics or storytelling? What drives fan engagement more?
Oh, geez. Well, I'll say data analytics with a caveat, all right,
Okay.
which is, it's another good question though. And the reason I say data analytics is with a caveat. The caveat is I've yet to see really good visualization of data analytics. It's really just charts and things we've been doing for like 1,000 years. So I think data analytics is ultimately more powerful as an engagement tool. I just haven't seen it used very well most often.
Okay. Cricket in India or AFL in Australia, which fan base is more intense?
Oh, cricket in India. I mean, and don't get me
I
wrong,
knew that.
AFL fan base is intense. They just had the grand final, da da da. I went to, and I realized this is not in India, but I was lucky enough to go to the India-Pakistan match at the
Ah,
MCG in
yes.
sort of World Cup ago. That was, I mean, hair on my arm just stands up. Right? I'm not even sure I've got a word to describe it.
Agree, agree, agree. One leadership lesson in one line you learned the hard way when you worked back in Sony, Universal, or Viacom, or any other like organizations.
Yeah, look, I think I learned the same thing a few people learn the hard way every now and then, which is, and I know, as people matter most,
Hmm.
right? And it's everyone knows that. I don't know many people who would say that's not true, right? So it's not as if there are people walking around saying, people matter least. Now, there are a few of those, but for the most part, not. Um, but I think it's easy sometimes to lose sight of that. Um, and I think the easiest thing to lose sight of is the world doesn't look at the world through your eyes, right? The world looks at the world
Yes.
through their eyes, right? And so
Absolutely.
it's easy to pass judgment because you don't actually know what's going on. And so I think that's people matter most. Don't forget that.
Absolutely. Last one is streaming live or stadium experience. What's your favorite?
Oh, Stadium. I mean, I like streaming live. Don't get me wrong. I've got like four different services. I'm just watching the Yankees game, and I'll be watching some. To me right now is like the crazy time. Hockey's starting up. The NFL's already started up.
Yes.
Major League Baseball's ending. EPL just started. The cricket season's about to launch here. Blah 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 blah. And by the way, weirdly enough, for a Canadian, I'm cricket mad. That's a whole other conversation. Um, and so it's a great time of year. And so I love streaming services, but there's nothing like being there. Nothing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Now, just one question. You'll have to answer it in 30 seconds. What is the role of AI into digital revolution and entertainment?
Today, should be mostly about cost reduction, but the future is in creativity, particularly in distribution.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott, for joining us today. And I really enjoyed the conversation what we had. Thank you once again for joining.
Great questions. I had a great time as well.
Perfect. So, everyone, please stay connected. Please share this episode with all the people who love sports and technology. We will meet in the next episode in the next week. Until then, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring.